there is a question which is related to risk of bias in the chat. Mayank, I hope I pronounced that right, is asking about the Cochrane risk of bias tool. So is it okay to use the Cochrane risk of bias tool if one does not have access to the risk of bias 2 tool? Sorry, Leslie, I think I'll probably take this one.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Generally, we'd encourage people to use the risk of bias 2 tool that's been developed and launched over the last few years, because it is an improvement on the risk of bias 1 tool. Having said that, people can still use risk of bias 1 when they're doing Cochrane reviews. That is okay. I think RevMan Web, obviously RevMan Web is for Cochrane reviews, but you can use RevMan Web for non-Cochrane reviews. You can contact the RevMan Web development team to organise that, to ask about that. I'm not sure if that's answered the question. Please feel free to ask a follow-up question if I've not quite answered that. Okay. Oh, thanks. So Ursula's put a link in about RevMan. Thanks, Ursula. And a comment about risk of bias 2. It takes ages to complete risk of bias 2 tool when there are many studies. That's a really interesting point, and actually it links neatly to the theme of scope that we've been discussing. Yes, risk of bias 2, the risk of bias 2 tool can be more time consuming. So what we encourage authors to do is to very carefully pre-specify what outcomes you're going to assess with risk of bias 2, because risk of bias 2 is outcome based rather than study based. You're just assessing a particular result with risk of bias 2. So we encourage people to have very focused objectives, and to only carry out risk of bias 2 on results and outcomes that actually appear in summary of findings tables. So again, we encourage people basically, I guess, to think about scope when you're doing your review, because that'll impact how much risk of bias 2 work that you end up having to do. And I would also say that risk of bias 2 does get easier with practice. It does seem quite daunting when you first look at it, and there are many domains and you have to look at each result, but it does get easier once you practice with it.
Can I jump in there as well, Rachel?
Yeah, Leslie, please.
I think with risk of bias 2, it can be quite cumbersome time-wise to do at the start, but also I think it's what's particularly powerful about it is that you have an overall risk of bias that you generate for each of your studies, and that can be helpful in managing the scope of your review as well later on, because it gives stronger justification, as long as you defined it in your protocol stage, for dropping out certain studies if you have quite a large amount of studies included from your analysis, if they're quite high risk of bias within reason. So I think it is quite difficult to get used to at the start, but also can be quite helpful in managing scope moving ahead.
Thanks, Leslie. Okay, we've got a question from Tuta. Again, I hope I've pronounced that okay. How does the scope relate to guidelines and reviews used to inform the evidence for guideline development or update?
So I think this is a two-way process. So if you're my experience of guidelines have very much only been from what's laid out by the WHO in terms of guideline development. But the way they do it is they have a guideline development group that sort of outlines what they see as the key questions that they want answered, and also they would outline what they value as important outcomes, hopefully with the consideration of key stakeholders for that particular intervention. So they sort of set the initial scope from there, and it's up to methodologists and review authors to consider is that guideline question actually an answerable question in the format of a systematic review, and then B is there knowledge of sufficient amount of evidence out there to embark on this systematic review. So I guess that's a top-down process, and the way it feeds back up. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is the way you set your scope can impact how review updates are done moving ahead, and hopefully review updates are informed by previous iterations of a review. So considering whether it's necessary to embark on an update given new research, has that new research answered or tackled outstanding research questions? And one would hope that trialists and primary researchers do look to systematic reviews to sort of inform them on what are the outstanding questions out there. Cool.
Thanks, Leslie. Another question from Nicholas. Hi, Leslie. If I heard correctly, you mentioned that you would touch on grouping interventions later on in the presentation. Could you please elaborate on how to do this?
Yeah, so this was related to this slide in particular, which was the example I used from a malaria review on housing modifications. But essentially, the point to get across is if you have complex interventions or interventions, a review that has quite a wide range of interventions, then it's important to consider how you meaningfully categorize these into certain groups, so that it makes things easier moving ahead in terms of planning your analysis and grouping your analysis so that you have comparators under each of these groups. Also makes it much more easy, readable for the reader, and much easier to summarize for yourselves. I think the important point here is that the way you group these interventions don't necessarily have to be, but although it does help if they are industry standards in that the categories that everyone in that particular field will recognize. But as long as you define it properly in your review, then don't be afraid to group it in your own certain manner.